Climate and Capital Media, and Gabriela Herculano, who is founder and CEO of Clima Investments. So let's dive right into it. So tell me, and so first I'm gonna ask the softball first to get you warmed up and fired up and excited, and then I'm gonna start asking some really hard questions. So my softball question is, tell me, A, what you're really excited about in the space and what you think the investment opportunity is in the climate space. Blair, you can take that if you'd like.
Sure. Well, really excited post the election because not only has that shifted the dial on action and investment as well, and the kind of speed of change from fossil fuels to a whole range of low carbon tech that's emerging, already existing and emerging. But I guess more importantly, Asia in particular, the announcements from China, South Korea, and Japan before the election to commit to net zero really signals that shift is happening all over the world very, very quickly. Whereas I would say in the last 15, 20 years, it's been almost a slow drag of change, and a lot of it policy-led versus financially led. And now that's really, really going to shift. So where we've seen great speed in the past, there's really been policy-driven kind of action and encouragement. But now it's kind of open season for investors and opportunities that are going to develop probably in the next 5 to 10 years.
And that's what I would love to dive into a bit more. So same question to you, Gabby. What are you really excited about? And by the way, I was on another panel, completely unrelated to climate, where the panelist was talking a lot about distributed energy as like having huge upside. So I think that there are areas around climate that it's like, wow, that's exciting. That's going to get big. And so I'm interested in getting into those areas as well. So talk to me what you're excited about, Gabby.
We're excited about a lot of different things, Jim. And I think that maybe this is a once in a lifetime opportunity, because we see tailwind coming from different sides and different in different order of magnitude, right? So we have regulation or policies that are global in nature. Paris Agreement is an example. Then we have a lot of country-specific support, Norway with EVs, China with EVs, right? And then we have consumers changing their behavior, embracing new technologies, embracing shared economy, Uber, which is, in our view, sustainable, a source of CO2 avoidance. Everything that we do is about CO2 avoidance. Plant-based diet, right? You don't have to be vegan to embrace that. And there's an element of CO2 avoidance embedded in that. So you put all of this together and we see opportunities in a lot of different segments and subsegments. The big picture here is hydrogen, green hydrogen. Is that going to become a very material and meaningful solution for energy storage, right? So renewable energy intermittence. Also in parallel with electric vehicles, right? Are we going to see a lot of hydrogen cars, right? Powered by fuel cells. Some fuel cell companies are doing tremendously well this year. So that is the whole vehicle to grid and the distributed energy unfolds. It's not a pie in the sky, it's happening. The technology is there. This is going to happen, and it's going to happen in our view very fast. And then combined with that, a very material investment in grid overall. Generally speaking, hydrologists had a very interesting corporate event, and they were talking about how they quantify this boom in the smart grid. We're talking about 3 times the investment level from the past 10 years in the next 10 years. So I think the next years will be indeed a decade of change. And then from the financial sector, as you know, we have a benchmark on the companies that can decarbonize the planet. We see this push-pull, right? Now ESG, especially on this side of the pond, I'm in London, ESG is a pretty big deal. So we see more regulation, and we see more investors asking for better products and more disclosure and all that good thing. And then the financial sector, right? We're supplying, right? We're coming with innovation. We think what we're doing is very relevant. So that is all happening, and it's all happening at the same time. So I think that we're creating a gigantic momentum and going in the right direction. And I find that very exciting.
Yeah, so I've got a lot of questions to ask. So you like just start firing off the neurons in my brain, I guess. And so one thing that I'm really interested in in talking to Blair, I think you've got such an interesting perspective because your perspective is not an American or European perspective. Your perspective is an Australian perspective. It's more of an Asian perspective. And that to me is incredibly interesting. Not just in the sense of climate and what's going on there, and the fact that, by the way, the Chinese government can decide overnight and did no more gas-powered motorcycles, electric motorcycles only.
Gone. Yeah, the gas petrol's gone.
It's amazing, and they can crack down the coronavirus as well, and boom, no coronavirus. So, like, it's really interesting to me that China is kind of ascendant now. And it's staking out this climate position almost as like a global power play. We're just getting right now. And like I'm incredibly interested in that and would love your views on that.
Sure. Well, every expert I talk to says the timing of the China announcement to go net zero before the US election was critical because just that they're grabbing that space. And it's obviously not just the international power negotiation role it can play, but also the economic power. I mean, it is without a doubt the fastest growing, supplier of all the stuff we're talking about, whether it's batteries to go with renewables themselves, this move quickly to EVs. As you say, they can just flip the switch. But also, it's not just China. When China, and in this case, South Korea was actually way ahead in establishing a Green New Deal, one of the strongest globally, as part of an election platform some time ago. That Asian countries just pile in behind, and the money moves and the technology moves very fast. That impacts Australia, of course, because we're the largest exporter of coal and natural gas. There goes that market, right? So if you're not preparing for that transition economically, both as an economy, as a country managing that transition, but also as investors and the tech providers that are interested in moving into the space, to understand that market, I think you really have to look how fast Asia is moving.
Let's talk a little bit about where the economic opportunities are. I think you're both unique in that this space historically has been so driven by regulation and government, and that's starting to really change. And you see a lot of private development in different industries that seem like they have huge upside. I mentioned distributed energy. Talk about the opportunities that you're most excited about, both in terms of the impact that they could have through private enterprise and the investment opportunity.
Yeah. Well, I could rattle off my top 5 very quickly if you want me to do that fast, and then Gabriella could come in with her take on. She's touched on quite a few of them. My quick 5 would be green hydrogen, which is dependent really on very inexpensive renewable energy. So Australia is really well placed for that. Our renewables are incredibly affordable. So look to the price of renewables in the countries developing them. That's critical. Batteries, renewable energy, microgrids, and how people will use their own battery system as a home power station, and the whole structure around that. For Americans, where we might not be so great at building the stuff, what we could be very, very good at is managing complex systems. So the AI part of all of this complex systems management, including climate risk and climate risk data, but also things like impacts. So now we're going to start to see a combination of extreme weather hitting all kinds of infrastructure. How do we manage that? And the US and AI are really important, I think, to just to mention, Google has partnered with NOAA recently just to map out better looking ahead to how extreme weather is going to impact people, communities, infrastructure, and that's going to be a really big part of climate in the future. And then I guess the last thing I'd mention, besides kind of tracking things like climate bonds and green bonds and what they're large scale investments. So looking to who are those putting those projects together, who's backing it, and that idea of blended finance in the climate solution space. So it will be, I think, everywhere a combination of investors, governments, and sort of things like the larger banks, as well as foundations that are interested in driving the change. So I see those trends as kind of the things to watch, and we'll be covering a lot of that in Climate and Capital Media to make sure business people can actually see this stuff. It's very hard if you're not paying attention to it all the time to kind of track these trends. It's moving so fast, and you're trying to track it across different government systems and policy. They're making a real difference.
And I think it's really interesting as well that large institutional investors have started to get very active. It's almost it's become a non-controversial space, right? Like you've got Larry Fink from BlackRock saying, if you're not thinking about carbon, it's investment malfeasance, basically, right? Because it will directly impact future returns. And so I think that that's really interesting and has shifted the dynamic a little bit. My sense is that regulation is still incredibly important and is going to be. So my next question, and Gaby, maybe you can tackle this one, is what do you think the balance is, or what's more important? Is it that regulation that then drives the innovation, or is it innovation kind of moving more on its own than it has in the past? And obviously some of that's dependent on where different countries are, right? Like the US is behind Europe, et cetera. But would love your view on that.
I think it depends, right? Is that famous answer? It depends. I think green hydrogen in Europe, we need the support, right? EU Green New Deal is looking to boost that green hydrogen market, and we need still incentives for that. The shape of the curve on the adoption for EVs is still, I think, very much a function of, again, a tax incentive for consumers to embrace, right? Because we are not at parity, right? Renewable energy, where we have achieved that in 2019, parity with fossil fuel. The electric vehicles are still more expensive than ICEs. So a tax incentive would, I think, make that shape of that curve of that adoption, and then therefore the vehicles to grid for the cars that already have the dual inverter, right? So it will play, right? One thing will, I think, help that curve, will define the shape of the curve. Just to touch on the previous question, I think that we love the analogy to the California gold rush, and we look very much at the shovel maker. Right? So the companies that their solutions, their products, their services can enable the creation of CO2 avoidance, right? So one side you have the companies that are reducing their carbon footprint, well, because they're using those solutions. And we think that there's some very interesting companies that do, for example, smart meters or smart thermostats, right? All about energy efficiency. Some pretty interesting names and exciting stories. There's a company in the US that does battery storage solutions. They bought a software company, and they're trying to grow more in that space. So it's about that for the vehicles to grid is about the ability to do the peer-to-peer transaction, right? So that my house can sell to your house kind of thing. It's extremely exciting, and it's going that way. So that is innovation. So then going back to your current question, Jim, I think that's innovation. You don't necessarily need the government to say we need energy efficiency. The demand is already there and the technology is already there. So it passed the point where we need, I think, support from the government, whether it's directly policy or subsidies, as in green hydrogen, or with tax incentives, right, for people to buy and then adopt technologies. It's going to be very exciting to watch these unfold.
Let's talk a little bit about flattening that curve, by which I mean you've got these. A lot of the times, how policy is set is you've got these goals that are set way out, and they're tough goals, and all the change is slated to happen way down the curve. and we are, and in an unrealistic way. And we obviously want that curve to flatten so that more of the change happens sooner. And I think there are obviously obstacles to making that happen. I guess the big question for you, Blair, is, are we past the point of no return? Like how, like Blair and I, for a little context, had this big debate where I came on the first time I met her and I was like, why aren't we doing nuclear in the interim? Because like that we could quickly like solve all of our problems, geopolitical and carbon in one fell swoop. And like, are we not being unrealistic thinking we can get there quick enough with alternative energy, right? So we had this, so I would love you to kind of answer me again for this crowd in terms of where you think we are and how optimistic you are for us to get to the other side.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think it's, cautious optimism and very practical to watch how fast we can deliver the solutions that make good sense for where you're rolling them out. I mean, one of the challenge of nuclear is size and the cost and risk. It's just too big, too unwieldy, and really dangerous. If you couldn't necessarily roll that out in developing countries, for instance. They don't have the infrastructure to manage the safety risks associated with it. And the cost is just astronomically expensive. So this offers us an opportunity that addressing climate really does offer us the economic opportunity to shift away from this big kind of top-down energy approach to a really different model that is adaptable for where you're using it. So that offers lots of opportunities, both for investment, but also for community ownership and this idea of the blended financing of solutions where different kind of packages work in different places. So I'm optimistic because that's more flexible. It's more adaptable for where you need different types of solutions. And we are watching that speed happen, I have to say, faster than I thought it would happen. And if you'd asked me 3 years ago, would I think all of Asia, EU, and the US would shoot for net zero, I would have said utterly impossible. That exists right now as of today. And that's, open the season for how everybody dives in and becomes part of that movement of money and solutions. I think that's a great thing. And if you look, the US has set a target of, I think, 1.7 trillion for a green recovery in the Biden package for climate as a post-COVID, financial support structure. That's mostly going to be focused on low carbon innovation. So and things like renewable transformation, the opportunity of that is enormous to kickstart in the States. But you can see the same kind of quick movement of money in other places in the world, and I think people are pretty excited about that and seeing what those solutions look like. So it's got a lot of really good, feeling about ticking a number of boxes and solving a lot of problems. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I think I'm pretty excited about where we'll go in the next 1 to 3 years. And that's the time to watch. For instance, does Asia shift the money out of already planned fossil fuel projects? If so, we're on the way. If they continue on and decide, well, we can squeak in another 20 coal plants, then we have to worry. So it's really that question of watching the speed in the next 1 to 3 years.
Very interesting. We have a really nice question from Linda John. She says, the path to carbon avoidance, can you see the question?
Yeah.
It's in that is clear in power, transportation, residential, commercial buildings, but it's pretty hard for heavy industries, cement, steel, high heat from the demand, high heat from fossil
green
fuels.
hydrogen
Potential. Breakthroughs.
Yeah, and things like aviation and shipping. Who owns aviation fuel answers. If it's green hydrogen and you're the company, you're going to be really happy in the next 20 years. And there's real potential there. Boeing's doing a project here in Australia with a research group looking specifically at a transition, 3-stage phased transition to hydrogen as a possible aviation fuel. So needless to say, everyone's looking at it and investing in it. I'd be curious to hear, Gabriella, what you think in Europe. I know quite a few European countries are looking at green hydrogen as well, but how you feel about it as an opportunity.
Yeah, Iberdrola is investing in it, and I think that it could change everything, right? And then the idea of solving energy storage, right? We still have the intermittence, and then that goes back to your nuclear question, right? We don't really need nuclear if we can solve intermittence. And then I think hydrogen can also solve that, right? So it's going to be a good solution for heavy duty transportation, right? For also maritime and aviation, and I think also for heavy industries like cement, steel. This solution is hydrogen, right? So it has to work. But there are books written about the hydrogen economy back in the 70s, right? So, but I think that now it is different with renewable energy becoming so competitive. But I think
I
that
told these guys sorry, go ahead, Gaby.
No, I was just going to say that the cement and steel question reminds me of the issue of circular economy, right? If there is one area that I think is a bit too fragmented and it's tied to climate changes, and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is always talking about that, right? How circular economy has everything to do with the heavy industries, right? Also with fashion, for example. But if we don't solve that, and that is a very fragmented segment, right? Because in Europe is all about the different municipalities, right? And the way that they do the collection and the sorting and all of that. So that is one where I think that the speed, unlike green transportation and green energy, is not at the same, is behind. And it's an area that we need to look into.
So do you mean, Gabrielle, the reuse of things and things like steel and aluminum being able to make that circular so that your raw source is coming back from what you've already produced?
Exactly.
And again, it lends itself to this complex system management stuff that I think the US could really shine in an AI way. How do you manage that? Well, it's going to take a really strong focus in understanding all the inputs, the supply chain, the transport factor, and then how do you tie it all together? So it's a huge opportunity for the US if it can sort of turn its attention to climate and the sort of integrated solutions that are going to be necessary. I think there's huge potential there.
Gaby, can you talk a little bit about the pick and shovels of the hydrogen technology? What are the investment plays there? And kind of, can you go into a little bit more detail? I don't really understand the space. I was going to say it was my freshman science fair project, splitting hydrogen and oxygen.
So if you have a negative screening approach, which we do, right? So we don't want direct exposure to companies that are EMP, right? So if you want to play that and you are not opposed for whatever reason to the idea of investing into EMP companies, right? So BP, for example, they have announced also a lot of investments in hydrogen, right? So that is one way to play. We don't want to pursue that strategy. We're all about CO2 avoidance, so that's not a strategy that appeals to us. And we think that the most exciting way to bet into the hydrogen economy is through fuel cells. So you bet into the companies that are manufacturing fuel cells, and the applications are there, right? So for hydrogen power vehicles, for trucks, distribution, there are some interesting names. There are a lot of different companies, different places. A little bit fragmented. I can give you 5 names of companies that are doing fuel cells, and I think fuel cells is a very good proxy for direct exposure to hydrogen. Iberdrola is a good way to play, although it does not represent and will not represent the material part of what they do, for given that their installed capacity in renewables is so big. But they are investing, and if you have that negative screening, you don't want EMP exposure. It could be a relevant player. But I really think that the very interesting way to bet on the hydrogen economy is through fuel cells.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I typically think, okay, so the companies that control the infrastructure, they're going to end up, many of the largest companies, co-opting that business anyway, right? Like, I mean, I'll give you an example in our business in the financial services, where the robo business, that's where everything's going. Digital, downstream, direct to retail. And who are the biggest robo players now? Like 5 years into the business, Schwab and Vanguard, right? Like they've stepped in and they've sort of co-opted the technology. And so it's like the people who control the pipes ultimately will shift to that. But I think energy is a little different because the pipes could be potentially fundamentally rebuilt, right?
Yeah.
Like, so it's really interesting. I think that
also in a funny way, because there's been so much pushback from fossil fuels, and particularly, pure play, who are just saying we're going to, like tobacco, we're going to try and force as long as we can to to pull every dollar out of selling coal, oil, and gas. Wrong perspective, right? Because if you're pushing out for something that's inevitably dying because the market's going to dry up, once Paris was signed, pretty much the world decided that's done now, we're going to move to something else. But you see the major players all continuing on and very slow to adapt. BP's had 3 bites at that cherry, and, it's hard to believe them on the 3rd time, but, maybe that's their lucky number. But here in Australia, we've got, particularly gas companies who refuse to accept that their market's going to go. And during the pandemic, we had ships of gas circling the globe with no market to take it. If that doesn't send you a message that it's time to diversify, then, you've missed your moment, I think. So in a funny way, that kind of denial of the transition for many companies has meant that they've refused to see the complexity of a transformation in a very different energy system. And now we're seeing that system pretty much emerging everywhere. And Gaby's talked about fuel cells and EVs and the connection of that plus renewables, and how people will manage what they need, where they need it, versus this big clunky, you dig the stuff out, you ship it around the world, and you stick it, you burn it, and send it in a pipe. And you look at it now and you almost think, wow, that's ancient. Already that looks so kind of out of touch with the kind of energy systems that we're building all over the world. And the developed country has that unique opportunity of leapfrogging past all the mistakes that we've made in the West, potentially, and going straight to that distributed, cheaper, cleaner opportunity. And in many ways could be leaders for rolling that out, because they don't have the difficulty of having to unwind one thing and start something altogether new.
Well, I think you really have to watch what happens in China, right?
Yeah.
China is incredibly interesting because, it's a well-run, thoughtful, centrally controlled ability to execute on a dime country that also, I think, sees it in sort of the course of history as this opportunity to really stake a global power leadership role. And so I would definitely look closely at China. What have you seen, Blair, in China? What are kind of the tea leaves, so to speak, saying with what's going on in China?
Well, I think, they've set a 2060 date for net zero, and everyone goes, oh, that's too long. But China usually moves much faster. They set a target, they send the message, and then they deliver it much more quickly. It would require them to transform their whole power structure, by 2050, and, they're on their way. So I think that's the first thing, is to watch how fast they move. They're definitely interested in all the innovation side of things, and they're already the big leaders on battery manufacture. And I think, I guess that tie into Asia and how they interact with other Asian countries in terms of satisfying all the kind of needs within the whole kind of low carbon side of things. Different countries are emerging as, good leaders at different types of things. Interestingly, battery build, I think Korea is an incredible place where the battery sort of tech and putting it all together is happening. A lot of the battery stuff that's happening in the US in terms of build is coming out of Korea, not China. But I think that's where to watch all these countries, whether Indonesia, which is a big coal exporter and heavily dependent, is very interested in moving. China is the likely helper there financially and tech-wise. So, watching the relationships that develop. Will China look to Indonesia as a test market for, can we go in there and help transform that economy? It can then do that anywhere in any part of the world. So I think it's those sorts of trends. We'll try to follow them at Climate and Capital, and it's a little harder for investors to look into where to put, investment in Asia, but there are lots of good places to look for information. I'd be curious to hear what you have to say, Gaby, about how investors analyze and look at the opportunities in Asia compared to other sort of more, things you're used to in Europe and the US.
Yeah, but I think one thing that is remarkable is that, for example, look at NIO and look at Xiaomi, right? Xiaomi is the Apple of China, but they have very interesting products that are sustainable products, like energy efficiency products. Look at NIO, right? Their battery as a service, it's very innovative, right? So you buy the car, but the battery is kind of like a separate product, right? So that gets financed and serviced in a different way. Tesla could have thought of that, right? It's very creative, it's very innovative, and it disassociates the car part from the battery part, right? So it puts the consumer potential reservations on that battery life and useful life and the cost of it, right? To rest. That's very creative. I mean, it's a phenomenal share performance, right? And I think so. The Asian decarbonizing Asian is a very interesting play, right? So it's supplying what will be consumed at that local market, right? So it's no longer keeping solar panels or wafers, right, to the Western countries, and I think that changes everything. And the creativity of some of this innovation in it's I think it's impressive.
Yeah, me too. And one thing to watch we've got a year to the next COP meeting, the UN climate talks, which, very policy driven, of course, but it has so much impact on where the, green dollars will go. So I think the two outstanding things on the agenda, and we'll watch whether they cover them and kind of push it out, are, and it's in the Biden plan. So why wouldn't they, at least step a little bit ahead of how you put trade barriers in place for the non-actors, and how that happens, like what is the stick that goes along with, the carrot of good policy in some places. So if countries are outliers, how are we going to manage whether we support them economically, but also how we deal with them internationally? And I think that'll be really interesting to watch. What kind of language do they use? And the other thing on the agenda, both on the Biden plan and likely to be more strongly felt, I think at COP, is an all-out ban on fossil fuel subsidies. If you change that tomorrow, talk about speed of change in the market. People are getting away with not truly costing anything to do with fossil fuels. All of the impacts of how we dig the stuff out, to transporting it, to burning it, to the impacts later. It's just not a market-driven energy system. No. Once you take
people don't even have that discussion, by the way.
It's shocking. It would be the number one thing that would change it.
It's similar to me of like the concept of like Amtrak has to pay for itself, right?
Right.
Like the highway system is completely subsidized.
Exactly.
It's insane to me. It's like
so whenever someone
subsidizing the worst thing. It's the same thing with food, by the way.
Yeah. Whenever someone says to you, but renewables, they can't make it without subsidies, you just have to laugh. The amount of money poured into the whole fossil fuel infrastructure around the world, in every country that uses it, it's astronomical. So that's a big game changer. If COP really addresses that and says, that's it, we're done with that, we have to flip that switch in order to, really speed up the change. A fear factor around, the world to pure play fossil fuels is that's the end,
Well, sadly, we are over time. I love what both of you are doing, sort of at the crossroads of impact and capitalism, real capitalism. And I think it's a really exciting space with a lot of things going on and huge growth in front of it. So love it. Love what you're working on. Thanks to both of you for coming.